It really feels like we're living through a major reshuffling of the global economic deck, you know? And the tensions between the U.S. and China, well, they're right at the center of it all.
Absolutely. It's impossible to ignore.
Yeah. And if you're like me, you want to understand what's really going on without getting bogged down in endless reports. So, for this deep dive, we're tackling the core of it. The U.S.-China trade relationship, those tariffs that just never seem to go away, and what it all could mean for, well, how money moves around the world.
It's a huge topic.
It is. We've pulled apart a recent discussion from the Tom Bilyeu Show and even dug into some pretty intense exchanges online to really try and get to the heart of it.
Good sources there.
Our mission today is pretty simple. Just give you the clear, essential insights into where things stand with U.S.-China economics right now, and maybe, just maybe, where things might be headed.
Okay, let's dive in then. One of the first things that really jumps out from the source material is China's very direct stance. Their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, according to their social media, basically said they are not in talks with the U.S. about tariffs. Period.
Wow. Just flat out.
Flat out. And they also stated very clearly that the fentanyl issue, that's solely a U.S. problem to handle.
Huh. That's a pretty blunt refusal, isn't it? To even discuss those key points, you can almost see the battle for public opinion happening, the U.S. trying to frame it one way and China just pushing back hard.
Definitely sets a confrontational tone right from the start.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating here, as we look a bit broader, is the perspective coming from someone we'll call Besant. He seems to be shifting, moving towards a more open conversation about what the U.S. strategy might actually be for rebalancing global trade.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, the transcript mentions him being involved in discussions, at places like the IMF and the World Bank about this very thing.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting then. It sounds like maybe the tariffs were just the opening salvo, like the first step.
That's the implication.
And the bigger picture could involve looking at China's actual role and influence within these big international financial organizations.
Exactly. That seems to be the argument taking shape. And if you connect that to the longer-term view, well, given how firmly both sides seem dug in China saying no talks, the U.S. pushing this rebalancing idea, a quick fix, seems really unlikely.
Right.
The source material suggests this could easily drag on for, well over a year.
Over a year. That feels like a pretty significant period of uncertainty.
That's right.
Makes you think about the foundations of the whole system we have now. The discussion mentions Bretton Woods, right, after World War II.
It does, yeah. That agreement basically created the IMF and the World Bank. And
Yeah.
the U.S. was, well, the dominant force in shaping it all back then.
So that post-war order, often called Pax Americana.
Exactly. Bretton Woods established that. The core idea was to align the national interests of the big players, especially the U.S., with a stable international order. The IMF and World Bank were the tools, really.
Right. So the original vision was the U.S. as the top economic dog, the dollar as the reserve currency, and these institutions helping rebuild, stabilize currencies, manage crises. Basically, the U.S. stepping up to lead the global economy.
That was the plan. Now, this brings us back to Besant and his argument for what he's calling a new world order. He frames it as a necessary adjustment, a rebalancing.
A new world order, huh? That phrase carries some weight.
It does, but here's the twist. It's being presented under the banner of America First, but he seems to be redefining that, framing it more as a call for deeper collaboration and, mutual respect among trading partners.
Okay. That sounds like a bit of a balancing act on the world stage. America First doesn't immediately scream, let's all cooperate more deeply.
No, it doesn't. There's definitely potential for that to be interpreted differently by other countries. It's a bit of a word game, perhaps.
Yeah, seems like it.
And this ties into a really important question for you to think about. How sustainable are the current global arrangements? Besson argues that these huge, persistent imbalances, we see big trade deficits and surpluses, they're just not sustainable long term.
And he's talking economic stability here, not like climate change sustainability.
Correct. In this context, it's purely about economic and financial stability. The argument is the current system generates imbalances that will eventually cause problems.
Okay, so what specifically about China's economic model does Besant point to as creating these issues? What's the core problem he sees?
Well, he really emphasizes how China's economy is tilted so heavily towards manufacturing for export, sometimes, at the expense of boosting its own domestic consumption. The argument is that China's growth plan relies a lot on exporting its way out of its economic troubles.
And that naturally creates these big trade surpluses with other countries.
Exactly. If you're exporting way more than you're importing consistently, someone else has to be doing the opposite.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
And this is where things like currency manipulation and maybe keeping wages artificially low come into play, that whole idea.
That's part of the argument, yes. The suggestion is that these practices make Chinese goods cheaper on the global market, which helps drive those exports but creates what others see as an uneven playing field.
Right, like subtly tweaking the money value and labor cost to get an edge.
Precisely. Besant suggests this helped China become this manufacturing powerhouse, but it leads to what many trading partners feel is an unfair situation, or at the very least an unbalanced one.
Got it. Now, the discussion also digs into criticisms of the IMF itself. What are the main complaints Besant raises there?
He talks about something called mission creep. His view basically is that the IMF has drifted away from its original core job,
Which was?
promoting international monetary cooperation and financial stability. He argues it's gotten too focused on other areas like climate change, gender issues, social stuff.
So, the argument is that focusing on those things, however important they might be, takes resources and attention away from the IMF's main gig, which is macro stability.
Exactly. He thinks it's diluting their effectiveness. He calls for the IMF to get back to being a brutal truth teller.
A brutal truth teller, okay. Meaning what?
Meaning being willing to call out countries, especially surplus countries like China, for policies he sees as distorting the global economy. Things like those opaque currency practices he mentions.
Okay. And what about how the IMF lends money? Any specific changes recommended there?
Yeah, he stresses that lending should really focus on helping countries with balance of payment problems like short-term cash flow issues between countries. And crucially, that help should be temporary.
Not just ongoing support.
Right. And with accountability, he suggests using KPIs, key performance indicators, to actually track if the lending is working.
Makes sense. And the World Bank also came up. Something about energy and lending to countries like China.
Yes. Besant argues the World Bank should focus hard on increasing energy access globally. And he advocates for an all-of-the-above approach, including things like natural gas, even nuclear, where it makes sense for cost and reliability, not just renewables.
Interesting. And the China angle.
He thinks the bank needs to get stricter about its graduation policy. Essentially, countries like China, which have developed significantly, shouldn't still be getting the same kind of development loans meant for much poorer nations.
Okay, that's a clear point. This whole discussion kind of makes you wonder, though, who actually decides these international rules? The source mentions the U.S. setting up Bretton Woods.
That's right. Historically, the U.S. was the architect. But things have changed. While the U.S. still has a big chunk of the voting power in the IMF, for instance, it's less than 20% now.
Less than 20%, so they can't just dictate terms anymore.
Not alone, no. They absolutely need to build coalitions, get other countries on board to push changes through.
Yeah, and the voting shares really show that complexity. You've got the U.S., but then China has a significant share too, and then you lump together, say, all the African nations.
Yeah.
It's a real mix.
It really is. Achieving consensus isn't easy, especially with China's economic weight and just the sheer diversity of interests around the world. Cooperation and negotiation are key.
Okay, switching gears just a little bit. The source material also touched on a few other global happenings that the speaker found noteworthy. Maybe we can quickly cover those for a bit more context.
Sure. One was pretty out there. The UK apparently considering dimming sunlight to fight global warming.
Dimming sunlight, seriously.
Yeah. The speaker and the source sounded pretty skeptical, pointing out the risks of unintended consequences and the absolute need for global agreement before trying something like that.
Wow. Okay, what else?
There was also discussion around the tension between parents' religious freedom and school curriculums, specifically mentioning LGBTQ+ topics. Justice Jackson's view came up emphasizing parental choice of school alongside the counter-argument that parents should have rights to opt out or choose alternatives.
Ah, okay, that ongoing debate.
Then another point was federal judges blocking some policies from the Trump administration, things like cuts to DEI funding and a voter ID requirement.
Right, the checks and balances in action.
Exactly. Presented as that classic tension between the executive branch and the judiciary, and it raises those fundamental questions about how far executive orders can go, constitutionally.
Gotcha. And one more.
Yeah. Finally, it touched on the flare-up in tensions between India and Pakistan after a terrorist attack. India used some pretty strong language, raising concerns about things escalating.
Hopefully that simmers down.
Let's hope so. The speaker certainly hoped it wouldn't blow up into something major, especially with everything else going on.
Right. So wrapping this section up, it's clear the U.S.-China economic dance isn't happening in isolation, is it?
Not at all. It's a huge piece, maybe the central piece, but it's part of a much bigger, incredibly complex global picture. And the way forward, well, it looks like it's going to be a long, drawn-out process as both sides navigate this shifting landscape.
Okay, so let's try and wrap up this deep dive, pull together the main threads for you. We've definitely seen that the U.S. and China are locked in this major economic competition.
No doubt about that.
And the U.S., working under this perhaps reframed idea of America first, seems to be trying to reshape the global financial order, using the existing tools like the IMF and World Bank.
Right, attempting to reform them from within, you could say. But as we've dug into, that whole effort faces some serious headwinds.
Yeah, there's resistance, obviously directly from China, but also
Yeah.
just the inherent difficulty of getting everyone on the same page internationally. It's a very different world now than it was when Bretton Woods was set up, Lots more
Yeah.
power centers. That's a great point. It leads to a final thought for you to maybe chew on. Considering that history, Bretton Woods and all that, and looking at the much more multipolar world we have today,
Mhm.
what kind of compromises, what new ways of cooperating globally might actually be needed to build an international economic system that's, well, more sustainable and maybe more equitable for the future?
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? Or maybe trillion-dollar now. It definitely makes you think about the long-term implications of these power shifts we're seeing.
Indeed. Something to keep an eye on.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive.